In the world of high-security government facilities, there exists an unwritten rule that has kept classified information safe for decades. Never underestimate the power of human error. What happens when a single joke delivered at the wrong moment to the wrong machine unravels years of carefully constructed security protocols? Marcus Chun thought he was just being funny when he leaned into that biometric scanner and whispered his sarcastic comment. He had no idea that his casual quip would trigger a cascade of events that would expose him to state secrets he was never meant to see, put him at the center of a security investigation that would question everything about modern digital protection, and ultimately reveal a flaw so fundamental that it would change how the most sensitive facilities in the world operate forever. Some mistakes are small, some are career-ending, and some accidentally unlock doors that were meant to stay closed until the end of time. This is the story of how 23-year-old Marcus Chun became the most unlikely person to ever gain access to classified information, all because he couldn't resist making a joke to a machine that, as it turned out, was listening far more carefully than anyone ever imagined. Marcus Chun had always been the type of person who found humor in the most inappropriate situations. It was both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. At 23 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in computer science, he had landed what most people would consider a dream job at Meridian Defense Solutions, a government contractor that specialized in cybersecurity for federal agencies. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, a gray concrete structure that blended perfectly with the industrial landscape of Northern Virginia. But Marcus quickly learned that appearances could be deceiving. Behind those bland walls lay some of the most sophisticated security systems in the world, protecting information that could literally change the course of international relations if it fell into the wrong hands. His first day had been a whirlwind of paperwork, background checks, and security briefings that left his head spinning. The woman conducting his orientation, Patricia Walsh, was a stern-faced government employee who spoke in clipped, precise sentences and seemed to view humor as a personal affront to national security. "Mr. Chun," she had said, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses as she led him through a maze of corridors, "I want to be absolutely clear about something. This facility operates under the highest levels of security clearance. Every door, every terminal, every piece of equipment you encounter has been designed with one purpose in mind: to ensure that classified information remains exactly that." Classified. Marcus nodded dutifully, though he couldn't help but notice the irony that someone was telling him about the importance of keeping secrets in a voice loud enough for half the building to hear. He bit his tongue, literally, to keep from making a comment. The tour continued through a series of increasingly secure areas. First, they passed through what Patricia called the General Access Zone, where employees with basic clearance handled routine administrative tasks. The offices here looked like any corporate environment, with the standard-issue cubicles, motivational posters, and the ever-present hum of fluorescent lighting. As they moved deeper into the building, the atmosphere began to change. The hallways became narrower, the lighting more subdued, and the number of security cameras visible on the walls increased exponentially. Marcus counted at least 15 different surveillance devices in a single corridor, and Patricia noticed his attention to them. "Each camera is monitored in real time by our security team," she explained, her voice taking on an almost reverent tone. "But more importantly, they're integrated with our facial recognition system. The computer knows who belongs where and who doesn't." They stopped at the first of several security checkpoints, where Patricia produced a badge that she pressed against a small black panel mounted on the wall. A soft beep indicated approval, and a heavy steel door slid open with a mechanical whoosh that reminded Marcus of something from a science fiction movie. Basic badge access Patricia said, clipping the badge back to her lapel. This gets you into areas consistent with your current clearance level. As you prove yourself and gain additional security credentials, you'll receive upgraded access. Marcus fingered the temporary badge that had been assigned to him during his initial processing. It was a simple plastic card with his photo, name, and a magnetic strip, nothing fancy. But Patricia assured him that within a few days, he would receive his permanent badge with all the electronic components necessary for the building's security systems. The next checkpoint was more sophisticated. Instead of a simple badge reader, this one featured a flat glass panel about the size of a tablet computer. Patricia approached it and placed her right hand on the surface, fingers spread wide. Biometric scanner, she explained as thin red lines of light moved back and forth under the glass, apparently reading her handprint. This technology reads not just your fingerprints, but the unique patterns of blood vessels in your hand. It's virtually impossible to fake. The scanner beeped twice, and another heavy door opened. Marcus was impressed despite himself. He had studied cybersecurity in school, but seeing these systems in action was something else entirely. The really sophisticated areas, Patricia continued as they walked, use multiple forms of authentication. Badge access, biometric scans, and voice recognition, all integrated into a single system that cross-references your identity against a database of authorized personnel. As if on cue, they arrived at what was clearly the most secure checkpoint they had encountered yet. This area featured not one, but 3 different scanning devices arranged in a small alcove before a final door that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. Patricia approached the first scanner, which looked similar to the handprint reader they had just used. "Hand scan first," she said, placing her palm on the glass. The red lights danced across the surface, and a computerized voice announced, "Identity confirmed. Please proceed to voice verification." Patricia stepped to the second device, which looked like an old-fashioned telephone handset mounted on the wall. She picked it up and spoke clearly into it. "Patricia Walsh, Security Clearance Level 7, proceeding to Sector 4 for orientation purposes." Voice pattern confirmed. The computer responded immediately. "Please proceed to final authentication." The third scanner was the most impressive of all. It looked like a small television screen mounted at eye level, and when Patricia stepped in front of it, Marcus could see that it was projecting some kind of scanning beam across her face. "Retinal scanner," she explained without turning around. "Reads the unique patterns in the blood vessels behind your eyes. Every person's retinal pattern is completely unique, and unlike fingerprints, it's impossible to alter or damage in a way that would fool the system." "Retinal scan complete," the computer announced. "Welcome, Patricia Walsh. Access granted to Sector 4. The vault-like door slid open with a deep, resonating hum that Marcus felt in his chest. Beyond it lay a corridor that looked like something from a different world entirely. The walls were lined with a metallic material that seemed to shimmer in the carefully controlled lighting, and the floor was made of some kind of composite material that absorbed the sound of their footsteps completely. "This," Patricia said with obvious pride, "is where the real work happens. The information processed in this sector is classified at levels that most government employees will never even know exist. The people who work here have undergone background investigations that take years to complete, and they've sworn oaths that legally bind them to maintain secrecy for the rest of their lives." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the carefully controlled temperature in the corridor. The weight of what he was seeing was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just a high-tech office building. It was a fortress designed to protect secrets that could affect the lives of millions of people. They walked past a series of offices with frosted glass windows that completely obscured the view inside. Marcus could hear the soft clicking of keyboards and the occasional murmur of voices, but he couldn't make out any words or see any of the people working beyond those barriers. "Your work area will be in Sector 2, Patricia explained as they turned and began walking back toward the less secure areas of the building. "That's appropriate for someone with your current clearance level and experience. But I wanted you to see this so you would understand the bigger picture of what we do here." As they retraced their steps through the various checkpoints, Marcus couldn't help but be impressed by the seamless way the security systems operated. Each scanner seemed to recognize Patricia instantly, and the doors opened without any delay or hesitation. It was clear that the technology had been refined over many years to achieve this level of sophistication. "The key to all of this," Patricia said as they walked, "is that every component of our security system is integrated with every other component. The badge readers talk to the biometric scanners, which talk to the voice recognition system, which talks to the central database that tracks every person's movements through the building. If any part of the system detects an anomaly, the entire facility can be locked down in a matter of seconds." Marcus nodded, genuinely impressed by the engineering that had gone into creating such a comprehensive security network. But even as he appreciated the technical achievement, a small part of his mind was already thinking like the cybersecurity specialist he had been trained to be. Every system, no matter how sophisticated, had vulnerabilities. The trick was finding them before someone with malicious intent did. They eventually arrived at Sector 2, which felt almost mundane after the high-tech wonderland they had just toured. The security here was still sophisticated by normal standards, with badge readers and cameras everywhere, but it lacked the science fiction atmosphere of the deeper levels. "This will be your workspace," Patricia said, leading him to a cubicle that was indistinguishable from dozens of others in the large, open room. "You'll be working with the systems integration team, helping to maintain and upgrade the various security protocols throughout the facility." Marcus looked around at his new environment. His co-workers seemed like perfectly normal people, the kind he might have encountered at any technology company. They were dressed casually, bent over their computers, and engaged in the kind of technical discussions he had heard countless times during his college years. "Your supervisor is Janet Morrison," Patricia continued, pointing to a woman in her 40s who was standing near a large whiteboard covered with technical diagrams. "She'll get you started on your initial projects and help you understand the specific systems we use here." As Patricia prepared to leave him in his new workplace, she turned and fixed him with a serious stare that made him feel like he was being evaluated by some kind of human lie detector. "Mr. Chun," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "I need you to understand something very clearly. The work you'll be doing here may seem routine, even boring at times. You'll be debugging code, updating databases, and running diagnostic tests on equipment. But every line of code you write, every system you test, every security protocol you help maintain is part of a larger system that protects information vital to national security." Marcus nodded solemnly, trying to project the kind of serious, responsible demeanor that he assumed was expected in this environment. "People's lives depend on the work we do here," Patricia continued. "Not in some abstract, theoretical way, but in very real, immediate ways. The information protected by these systems includes intelligence about terrorist threats, details about ongoing military operations, and diplomatic communications that could prevent or start wars. Do you understand the weight of that responsibility?" "I do," Marcus replied, and he meant it. Despite his tendency toward inappropriate humor, he was not someone who took responsibility lightly. Patricia studied his face for another long moment, then nodded curtly. "Good. Janet will take care of you from here. Welcome to Meridian Defense Solutions, Mr. Chun." I hope you'll find the work both challenging and rewarding." As she walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor, Marcus took a deep breath and looked around his new workplace. The reality of where he was and what he would be doing was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just a job. It was a chance to be part of something much larger than himself. Janet Morrison approached him with a warm smile that was a welcome contrast to Patricia's stern demeanor. She was dressed in jeans and a casual blouse, and her graying hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that suggested she was someone who prioritized function over form. "You must be Marcus," she said, extending her hand for a firm handshake. Patricia could be a little intense, but don't let that worry you. She takes security seriously, which is exactly what you want in someone responsible for protecting classified information. Marcus found himself immediately liking Janet. There was something about her relaxed confidence that put him at ease after the formal intensity of his orientation tour. "Let me show you around and introduce you to the team," Janet said, leading him toward the cluster of cubicles where his new co-workers were working. "The people here are some of the best cybersecurity specialists in the country. You're going to learn a lot." As they walked, Janet explained the basics of how the team operated. The Systems Integration Group was responsible for maintaining the complex network of security systems that Patricia had shown him during the tour. This included everything from the simple badge readers at the building entrance to the sophisticated biometric scanners protecting the most sensitive areas. "The interesting thing about working on security systems," Janet explained, "is that you have to think like both a protector and an attacker. We're constantly testing our own defenses, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with malicious intent." This was exactly the kind of work Marcus had hoped to do when he chose cybersecurity as his field of study. The challenge of building systems that could defend against increasingly sophisticated threats appealed to both his technical skills and his natural problem-solving instincts. Janet introduced him to his new teammates, a diverse group of specialists who range from recent college graduates like himself to veterans with decades of experience in government security. Each person he met seemed genuinely enthusiastic about their work, and Marcus began to feel that he had found a place where he could both contribute meaningfully and continue learning. The day flew by as Janet walked him through the various systems he would be working with. The technology was impressive, but what struck Marcus most was how thoughtfully everything had been designed. Every security measure had been implemented not just to be effective, but to be as seamless as possible for the people who use them every day. As the workday ended and Marcus prepared to leave, he reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few hours. This morning, he had been a recent graduate with a degree and some theoretical knowledge about cybersecurity. Now, he was part of a team responsible for protecting information that could literally affect global events. Walking back through the various security checkpoints on his way out of the building, Marcus paid close attention to how each system operated. The badge readers, cameras, and biometric scanners that had seemed so impressive during his morning tour now felt familiar, like tools he would soon learn to use and maintain. As he reached the final exit and stepped out into the parking lot, Marcus looked back at the unremarkable gray building that had become his new professional home. From the outside, it still looked like nothing special, just another piece of the sprawling government contractor landscape that dominated this part of Virginia. But Marcus now knew better. Behind those plain walls was a technological fortress protecting some of the most sensitive information in the world. And somehow, through a combination of hard work, good timing, and pure luck, he had become part of the team responsible for keeping that fortress secure. He had no way of knowing that within just a few days, his natural tendency to make jokes in inappropriate situations would lead to an incident that would expose fundamental flaws in the very systems he had been hired to protect. Marcus's first week at Meridian Defense Solutions passed in a blur of training sessions, technical documentation, and careful observation of how the facility's security systems actually worked in practice. What he discovered was both reassuring and slightly alarming. The technology was even more sophisticated than he had initially realized, but the people using it every day had developed habits that sometimes compromised its effectiveness. Janet Morrison proved to be an excellent supervisor, patient with his questions and generous with her time as she helped him understand the intricate relationships between the various security components. On his third day, she sat down with him in a small conference room to explain the theoretical foundation behind everything he had seen during his orientation tour. The entire security architecture is built on what we call the principle of layered authentication, Janet explained, drawing a diagram on a whiteboard that showed the building's layout with various security zones marked in different colors. Each layer provides a different type of verification, and each layer is designed to catch threats that might slip through the others. Marcus studied the diagram carefully. The building was divided into 7 distinct security zones, each requiring progressively more sophisticated authentication methods. The outermost zone, where visitors were processed and basic administrative work took place, required only a valid identification card and a brief background check. But as you moved deeper into the building, the requirements became exponentially more complex. Zone 4 is where things get really interesting, Janet continued, pointing to an area of the diagram that Marcus recognized from his orientation tour. This is where we start using multi-factor biometric authentication. Badge access gets you to the checkpoint, but then you need to pass hand geometry scanning, voice pattern recognition, and retinal scanning to actually gain entry. What happens if someone fails one of the scans? Marcus asked, genuinely curious about the error handling procedures. Janet smiled, clearly pleased by the question. That's where things get complicated. The system is designed to be both secure and user-friendly, which creates some interesting challenges. If someone fails a biometric scan, the system has to decide whether it's dealing with a technical malfunction, a legitimate user who's having problems, or a potential security threat. She turned back to the whiteboard and drew a flowchart showing the various decision points the system went through when handling authentication failures. Marcus was impressed by the sophistication of the logic, but he also began to see potential problems. What if someone's biometric data has changed since it was initially recorded? He asked. I mean, if someone gains or loses weight, or gets injured, or even just ages significantly, wouldn't that affect the accuracy of the scans? Excellent question, Janet replied. That's actually one of the ongoing challenges we deal with. The system is constantly updating its baseline data for each authorized user, learning from successful scans to account for normal changes over time. But dramatic changes can cause problems. She told him about an incident from the previous year when a senior analyst had broken his hand in a skiing accident. The injury had changed the geometry of his hand enough that the biometric scanner couldn't recognize him, even though his fingerprints were still valid. It had taken 3 days to resolve the issue, during which the analyst had to be escorted through the secure areas by other personnel. The really tricky part, Janet explained, is distinguishing between legitimate changes and attempts to fool the system. If someone's hand geometry suddenly changes dramatically, it could be because of an injury, or it could be because someone is trying to use a fake hand or some other spoofing device. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand the complexity of the challenge. Every security system was a balance between protection and usability, and That balance was constantly shifting as technology evolved and new threats emerged. Over the next few days, Janet introduced him to the actual hardware and software components that made the security system work. Much of his time was spent in a basement workshop area where technicians maintained and tested the various scanning devices used throughout the building. The workshop was a fascinating place, filled with partially disassembled biometric scanners, computer terminals displaying streams of diagnostic data, and testing equipment that Marcus had only read about in textbooks. The technicians who worked there were a different breed from the system's administrators upstairs, more focused on the physical hardware than the software that controlled it. Tom Reeves, the senior hardware technician, became Marcus's informal mentor during this phase of his training. Tom was a gruff man in his 50s who had been working with security technology since before biometric scanning was commercially viable. He had the kind of deep, practical knowledge that could only be gained through decades of hands-on experience. The thing people don't understand about biometric systems, Tom explained while showing Marcus the inner workings of a hand geometry scanner, is that they're not just reading your biological characteristics. They're also reading environmental factors, device variations, and even your behavioral patterns. He pointed to a series of sensors inside the scanner that Marcus hadn't noticed before. These don't just measure the shape of your hand. They measure the temperature, the humidity, the electrical conductivity of your skin, even the way you place your hand on the scanning surface. All of that data gets fed into algorithms that build a comprehensive profile of each user. Marcus was fascinated by the level of detail involved. He had assumed that biometric scanning was simply a matter of comparing current readings to stored data. But the reality was far more complex. The voice recognition system is even more sophisticated, Tom continued, leading Marcus to another workbench where a voice analysis terminal was connected to several speakers and microphones. It's not just analyzing the words you speak or the pitch of your voice. It's measuring breathing patterns, accent variations, even unconscious vocal habits that most people don't know they have. Tom demonstrated the system by recording his own voice saying the standard authentication phrase, Thomas Reeves, Security Clearance Level 5, requesting access for maintenance purposes. Then, he played back the recording while a computer program displayed a complex waveform analysis on the screen. See these patterns here? Tom pointed to specific portions of the waveform. This shows how I naturally emphasize certain syllables, the tiny pauses I make between words, even the way my voice changes slightly when I'm concentrating. All of that gets stored as part of my voice profile. Marcus watched as the computer highlighted dozens of subtle characteristics in Tom's speech patterns, each one contributing to a unique vocal fingerprint that would be virtually impossible for someone else to replicate convincingly. The retinal scanning technology was equally impressive. Tom showed Marcus how the system used infrared light to map the blood vessel patterns behind each user's eyes, creating what he described as the most reliable biometric identifier currently available. The thing about retinal patterns, Tom explained, is that they're determined by genetics and early childhood development. Unlike fingerprints or hand geometry, they don't change throughout your lifetime, and they're almost impossible to alter surgically or damage in a way that would fool the system. As Marcus learned more about each component of the security system, he began to develop a deep appreciation for the engineering achievement they represented. Every aspect had been carefully designed to address specific vulnerabilities while maintaining the usability that was essential for day-to-day operations. But he also began to notice things that concerned him. During his time in the workshop, Marcus observed several instances where the sophisticated technology was undermined by human factors that seemed to have been overlooked by the system designers. The most obvious example was what the technicians called tailgating the practice of following closely behind someone else through a security checkpoint without going through the authentication process yourself. Marcus watched this happen several times during his first week, usually when someone was carrying coffee or boxes and other employees held doors open to be helpful. The security cameras captured these incidents, but the human monitors watching the video feeds seemed to treat them as normal courtesy rather than potential security breaches. Marcus mentioned this to Tom during one of their training sessions. "You're not wrong," Tom acknowledged with a frustrated sigh. "We brought this up in security meetings dozens of times. The technology can track every person who successfully authenticates, but it can't account for people who slip through when someone else opens a door." Tom explained that the facility had tried several approaches to address this problem, including weight-sensitive floor panels that could detect when more people entered an area than had been authenticated, and motion sensors that tracked movement patterns to identify potential tailgating. But each solution created its own problems. The weight sensors were too sensitive, Tom said. They would trigger false alarms when someone was carrying heavy equipment, or even when someone had gained or lost weight since their last calibration. And the motion sensors couldn't distinguish between legitimate movement patterns and security breaches. Marcus also noticed that many employees had developed shortcuts and workarounds that made their daily routines more convenient, but potentially less secure. For example, he observed that some people would prop open secure doors with doorstops or books when they needed to move equipment between areas, bypassing the authentication systems entirely. "We mentioned this to Janet. She nodded knowingly. That's the eternal struggle in security design," she said. "If you make a system too restrictive, people will find ways around it that are actually less secure than a more flexible approach would have been." She told him about a previous version of the voice recognition system that had been so sensitive to background noise that it frequently rejected legitimate users who were speaking in normal office environments. Employees had started gathering in quiet areas to authenticate, which created bottlenecks and made it easy for unauthorized people to observe the authentication process. "The current system is calibrated to work reliably in realistic conditions," Janet explained. "That means it's slightly less sensitive than it could be in a perfect environment, but it's much more practical for actual daily use." As the second week began, Marcus started working on his first real assignment, updating the software that controlled the integration between the badge access system and the biometric scanners. It was exactly the kind of work he had hoped to do, challenging enough to be interesting, but not so complex that he was completely out of his depth. The project required him to understand how data flowed between the various components of the security system. When someone approached a checkpoint, their badge was scanned first, which triggered a database lookup to verify that the badge was valid and to retrieve the user's biometric profile data. Then, the biometric scanners would use that profile data as a baseline for comparing their real-time readings. Marcus quickly discovered that this process was more complex than it appeared on the surface. The system had to account for network delays, database conflicts, hardware malfunctions, and a dozen other potential failure modes while maintaining the seamless user experience that made the security system practical for daily use. His work involved writing code that would improve the error handling when communication between system components was interrupted or delayed. It was detailed, technical work that required careful attention to both security implications and user convenience. But as he dug deeper into the system architecture, Marcus began to notice something that troubled him. The various components of the security system were designed to work together, but they also had to be able to function independently when necessary. This redundancy was intended as a safety feature, but Marcus realized that it also created potential vulnerabilities. For example, If the central database that stored biometric profile data became unavailable, the individual scanning devices would fall back to using locally cached profile data. This ensured that authorized users could still gain access even during network outages, but it also meant that each scanner maintained its own copy of sensitive authentication data. Marcus spent several evenings at home thinking about the implications of this architecture. He understood the reasoning behind the design decisions, but his training in cybersecurity made him instinctively wary of any system that stored critical data in multiple locations. The more he learned about how the security system actually worked, the more he appreciated both its sophistication and its complexity. Every design decision had been made for good reasons, but those decisions also created new challenges and potential vulnerabilities. By the end of his second week, Marcus felt like he was beginning to understand not just how the technology worked, but how it fit into the larger ecosystem of security measures that protected the facility. He was also beginning to develop ideas about how some aspects of the system could be improved. Janet encouraged this kind of thinking during their regular check-in meetings. "Fresh eyes are valuable," she told him. "People who have been working with these systems for years can develop blind spots. Sometimes someone new can see things that the rest of us have started taking for granted." Marcus was grateful for her encouragement, but he was also aware that his understanding was still limited. He had learned enough to recognize the complexity of the challenges involved, but not enough to be confident about proposing solutions. As his third week began, Janet told him that it was time for him to receive his permanent security badge and to complete the authentication setup process that would give him independent access to the areas where he needed to work. "You'll need to visit each type of biometric scanner to create your baseline profile data," she explained. "It's basically the same process that every employee goes through, but since you'll be working on the systems themselves, you'll also get a behind-the-scenes look at how the data is captured and stored." Marcus was excited about this next step. He had been observing the authentication process from the outside, but he was curious to experience it himself and to see how the technology worked from the user's perspective. He had no way of knowing that his upcoming interaction with the biometric scanners would lead to a discovery that would change everything about how the facility's security systems operated. The appointment to set up Marcus's biometric profile was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in his third week. Tom Reeves would escort him through the process, partly to ensure everything went smoothly and partly to give Marcus additional hands-on training with the systems he would be maintaining. They started in Tom's workshop, where he had set up a portable version of the hand geometry scanner for initial testing and calibration. The device looked like a smaller version of the scanners Marcus had seen throughout the building, with a flat glass surface surrounded by metal housing that contained the various sensors and processors. "The first step is always calibration," Tom explained as he powered up the device and connected it to a laptop computer that would display the raw sensor data. "We need to make sure the scanner is reading environmental conditions accurately before we start capturing your biometric data." Marcus watched as the computer screen filled with numbers and graphs showing temperature, humidity, ambient light levels, and several other environmental factors. Tom made small adjustments to the scanner's settings while explaining how each variable could affect the accuracy of the readings. "The thing most people don't realize," Tom said, "is that biometric scanning isn't just about your biology. It's about the interaction between your biology and the environment where the scan takes place. Temperature affects the size of your blood vessels. Humidity affects the electrical conductivity of your skin. Even the lighting in the room can influence how the sensors interpret the data they're collecting." Once the calibration was complete, Tom had Marcus place his right hand on the scanner's glass surface. The device immediately began collecting data, and Marcus could see his hand's outline appear on a laptop screen as the sensors mapped its geometry. Try to relax your hand naturally, Tom instructed. Don't press down hard, but don't hold it too lightly either. The system needs to learn how you naturally interact with the scanner so it can recognize you consistently in the future. Marcus watched, fascinated, as the computer built a three-dimensional model of his hand from the scanner's data. The image on the screen showed not just the overall shape, but detailed measurements of finger length, joint spacing, palm width, and dozens of other characteristics that would form his unique biometric signature. The process took about 2 minutes, during which the scanner captured data from multiple angles and under slightly different lighting conditions. When it was finished, Tom showed Marcus the final profile that had been generated. This becomes your baseline, Tom explained, pointing to various measurements displayed on the screen. Every time you use a hand scanner in the building, the system will compare its real-time readings to this profile. If the match is close enough, you'll be authenticated. If not, you'll be denied access. Marcus studied the data with professional interest. The level of detail was impressive, but he also noticed that the system had flagged several measurements as having relatively high margins of error. When he asked Tom about this, the older technician nodded approvingly. Good catch. That's exactly the kind of thing you need to pay attention to when you're maintaining these systems. Those error margins tell us which aspects of your hand geometry are most reliable for identification purposes and which ones might cause problems if they change slightly over time. Tom explained that the system used a sophisticated weighting algorithm to emphasize the most stable biometric characteristics while de-emphasizing those that were more likely to vary from scan to scan. This helped ensure that legitimate users wouldn't be locked out due to minor variations in how they place their hands on the scanner. Next, they moved to the voice recognition setup. This process took place in a small, acoustically isolated booth that had been specially designed to minimize background noise and acoustic reflections that could interfere with the voice analysis algorithms. The key to good voice recognition, Tom explained as he adjusted the microphone position, is consistency. You need to speak in the same tone and pace that you'll use during normal authentication sessions. If you speak too carefully during setup, the system might not recognize your normal speaking voice. Marcus practiced the standard authentication phrase several times. Marcus Chun, Security Clearance Level 2, requesting access for authorized duties. Tom coached him on speaking naturally while maintaining clear pronunciation of each word. The voice analysis software displayed real-time waveforms and frequency analysis as Marcus spoke, and Tom pointed out various characteristics that the system was identifying as unique markers of his vocal patterns. See how your voice drops slightly on the word authorized? Tom asked, pointing to a specific portion of the waveform. That's the kind of unconscious speech pattern that makes voice recognition so reliable. Even if someone could imitate your general voice characteristics, they probably wouldn't know about subtle habits like that. The system captured multiple recordings of Marcus speaking the authentication phrase, then analyzed them to identify the most consistent vocal characteristics that could be used for identification. The final voice profile included data about fundamental frequency, formant patterns, speech rhythm, and several other acoustic features that were unique to Marcus's way of speaking. The retinal scanning setup was the most complex part of the process. The scanner required Marcus to position his eye precisely in relation to the infrared light source, while remaining perfectly still for the duration of the scan. This is where a lot of people have trouble, Tom warned as he adjusted the height and angle of the scanning device. It's natural to blink or move your eyes slightly when you see the infrared light, but the scanner needs you to hold completely still for about 10 seconds while it maps the blood vessel patterns behind your retina. Marcus found the process more challenging than he had expected. The infrared light was visible as a dim red glow, and his eye's natural response was to move away from it or to blink reflexively. It took several attempts before he was able to hold still long enough for the scanner to capture a complete retinal map. When the scan was finally successful, Tom showed him the resulting image on the computer screen. Marcus's retinal pattern looked like an intricate road map, with blood vessels creating a complex network of lines and curves that was apparently unique to his individual physiology. "This is the most reliable biometric identifier we use," Tom explained. "Retinal patterns are determined during fetal development and remain completely stable throughout a person's lifetime. They can't be altered surgically, and they're not affected by injuries or aging the way fingerprints or hand geometry can be." With all three biometric profiles created, Tom uploaded Marcus's data to the central authentication database. This process took several minutes, during which the system cross-referenced the new biometric data with Marcus's existing badge information and security clearance records. "Everything looks good," Tom announced when the upload was complete. "Your permanent badge should be ready tomorrow morning, and then we can test the complete authentication process in the actual secure areas." But Marcus was curious about something he had noticed during the setup process. Each of the biometric scanners had displayed diagnostic information that suggested they were capable of collecting much more data than was actually being used for authentication purposes. "The hand scanner measured at least 50 different characteristics of my hand," Marcus observed, "but the authentication algorithm only seems to use about 15 of them. Why collect data that you're not going to use?" Tom's expression became thoughtful. "That's a more complicated question than you might think. The extra data serves several purposes. First, it provides backup information in case the primary identification characteristics become unreliable for some reason. Second, it allows the system to improve its algorithms over time by analyzing patterns in the in-use data. And third, it helps with security research and system development." Marcus nodded, but something about Tom's explanation didn't quite satisfy him. There seemed to be more to the story, but he sensed that Tom either didn't know the full details or wasn't comfortable discussing them. The next morning, Marcus received his permanent security badge from the administrative office. It looked similar to his temporary badge, but it felt slightly thicker and had a more sophisticated appearance. Janet explained that it contained several different types of electronic components, including RFID chips, magnetic strips, and embedded processors that could communicate with the building's security systems. "This badge is essentially a miniature computer," Janet told him as they walked toward the secure areas where Marcus would be working regularly. "It stores encrypted versions of your authentication data, communicates with the central security database, and even tracks your movements throughout the building for safety and security purposes." Marcus was impressed by the sophistication of the badge technology, but he also found himself thinking about the privacy implications of having his location constantly monitored. When he mentioned this to Janet, she assured him that the tracking data was used only for security purposes and was subject to strict privacy controls. Their first stop was a Level 2 security checkpoint that Marcus would need to use regularly to access his work areas. The process was exactly as Tom had demonstrated. Badge scan, hand geometry scan, and voice authentication, all completed in less than 30 seconds. Marcus was pleased to discover that the system recognized him immediately and without any problems. The authentication process felt smooth and natural, which he knew was the result of careful engineering designed to balance security requirements with user convenience. But as they continued through several more checkpoints, Marcus began to notice something unusual. At each scanner, He could hear faint sounds coming from the devices that didn't seem to correspond to their normal operation. It was a soft clicking or buzzing noise that lasted for just a few seconds after each successful authentication. At first, he assumed it was normal operational noise, but his technical training made him naturally curious about any unexpected sounds from electronic equipment. During a pause between checkpoints, he mentioned the noise to Janet. "I haven't noticed anything unusual," she said, listening carefully as Marcus used the next scanner. "What kind of sound are you hearing?" Marcus demonstrated by placing his hand on a nearby scanner and listening carefully. Sure enough, there was a soft clicking sound that seemed to come from inside the device, lasting for about 3 seconds after the authentication was complete. Janet frowned slightly. That's not normal. These scanners are designed to operate almost silently. Any unusual sounds could indicate a hardware problem or some kind of interference with the scanning process. She suggested that they mention the observation to Tom, who would be able to diagnose any potential equipment problems. But Marcus was already starting to form a theory about what might be causing the unusual sounds. "What if it's not a malfunction?" he suggested. "What if the scanners are doing something additional after the normal authentication process is complete? Something that wasn't mentioned during my training." Janet looked surprised by the suggestion. "Like what?" "The authentication process is pretty straightforward. The scanner reads your biometric data, compares it to your stored profile, and either grants or denies access." "What else would it be doing?" Marcus wasn't sure, but his instincts told him that the clicking sounds were significant. He had learned to pay attention to unexpected behavior in electronic systems, because it often indicated something important that wasn't immediately obvious. When they returned to Tom's workshop later that day, Marcus described the sounds he had been hearing. Tom listened with increasing interest, then led them to a diagnostic terminal that could monitor the internal operations of the building's biometric scanners. "Let's see what's actually happening during the authentication process," Tom said as he connected to the scanner Marcus had been using. "This diagnostic system can show us every operation the scanner performs, including things that aren't normally visible to users or even to most technicians." What they discovered on the diagnostic display surprised all three of them. The scanner was indeed performing additional operations after each successful authentication, operations that weren't documented in any of the system manuals or training materials that Marcus had studied. "It's collecting additional biometric data," Tom said, studying the diagnostic readouts with a puzzled expression. "Data that's not part of the normal authentication process. And it's storing that data in a separate database that I've never seen before." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of additional data?" Tom scrolled through several screens of technical information before finding the details they were looking for. "It's recording secondary voice patterns, micro-expressions from facial analysis, even behavioral biometrics like typing patterns and gait analysis. Basically, it's building a much more comprehensive profile of each user than what's needed for basic authentication." Janet looked troubled by this revelation. "That's not supposed to be happening. The biometric scanners are only authorized to collect and store the specific data elements that are required for the authentication process. Collecting additional personal data would violate both our privacy policies and federal regulations governing the handling of biometric information." Marcus's mind was racing as he considered the implications of what they had discovered. Someone had apparently modified the building's security systems to collect much more personal information than was officially authorized or documented. Who would have the access and expertise to make changes like this? He asked. Tom and Janet exchanged glances that suggested this question had serious implications that Marcus didn't fully understand yet. Very few people have the clearance and technical access needed to modify these systems, Janet said carefully. And any changes are supposed to go through an approval process that involves multiple levels of authorization and security review. She paused, clearly weighing how much to explain to someone who is still relatively new to the organization. What you've discovered could indicate anything from an unauthorized research project to a serious security breach, she continued. Either way, we need to report this to the facility security officer immediately. As they prepared to escalate their discovery through the proper channels, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his casual observation about clicking sounds had uncovered something much larger and more significant than any of them had initially realized. The discovery that the biometric scanners were collecting unauthorized data triggered a security investigation that quickly escalated far beyond what Marcus had anticipated. Within hours of Janet's initial report to the facility security office, the building was swarming with investigators from multiple government agencies, each with their own theories about what might be happening. Marcus found himself at the center of the investigation, simultaneously valued for his technical insights and suspected as someone who might have discovered the unauthorized data collection because he was somehow involved in it. The sudden shift from promising new employee to potential security threat was disorienting and frightening. Special Agent Sarah Martinez from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office was assigned to lead the investigation. She was a serious woman in her 30s with the kind of focused intensity that made Marcus feel like he was being analyzed every time she looked at him. Her first interview with Marcus took place in a sterile conference room that he hadn't known existed in the building. "Let's start from the beginning," Agent Martinez said, consulting a thick folder of documents that presumably contained everything about Marcus's background, employment, and recent activities. "You've been working here for less than 3 weeks, and you've already identified a significant security anomaly that apparently went unnoticed by experienced personnel who have been here for years. That's either remarkable intuition or something more concerning." Marcus tried to remain calm despite the obvious implication of her statement. "I just noticed some sounds that seemed unusual. My training taught me to pay attention to unexpected behavior in electronic systems." Agent Martinez nodded, but her expression remained skeptical. "Tell me exactly what you heard when you heard it, and what made you think it was significant." Marcus went through his observations in detail, describing the clicking sounds, the timing of when they occurred, and his decision to mention them to Janet and Tom. Agent Martinez took careful notes and asked several follow-up questions that tested his memory and consistency. "You mentioned that the sounds occurred for about 3 seconds after each authentication. That's a very specific observation. How can you be so precise about the timing?" Marcus explained that his technical background had taught him to pay attention to timing patterns in electronic systems, since they often provided clues about what processes were running and how long they took to complete. It was the kind of analytical thinking that had served him well in his cybersecurity studies. Agent Martinez seemed satisfied with his explanation, but she continued to probe for details about his background, his motivations for taking the job, and his interactions with other employees. Marcus began to understand that he was being evaluated not just as a witness, but as a potential suspect in whatever was happening. The investigation quickly revealed that the unauthorized data collection was much more extensive than anyone had initially realized. The modified scanners weren't just collecting additional biometric data. They were also recording detailed behavioral patterns, analyzing stress indicators in people's voices, and even tracking micro-expressions that could potentially reveal emotional states or deceptive behaviors. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, a forensic cybersecurity specialist brought in from the FBI, explained the technical details to Marcus during one of several debriefing sessions. She was impressed by his initial observations and wanted to understand exactly how he had identified the anomaly. The modifications to these scanners represent extremely sophisticated work, Dr. Kane explained, showing Marcus computer displays that revealed the hidden software components. Whoever did this had intimate knowledge of both the hardware and software systems, plus the security clearances necessary to access the equipment without detection. The hidden system had been operating for at least 8 months, collecting vast amounts of personal data on everyone who used the biometric scanners. The data was being stored in an encrypted database that was physically located within the facility, but was apparently not connected to the normal network infrastructure. This represents a massive privacy violation, Dr. Kane continued. But it's also potentially much worse than that. The behavioral analysis capabilities suggest that someone was trying to identify patterns that could be used to predict or influence people's actions. Marcus felt a chill as he considered the implications. The unauthorized system wasn't just collecting data, it was analyzing that data to build psychological profiles of everyone who worked in the facility. Someone had essentially been conducting unauthorized surveillance and behavioral research on federal employees and contractors. The investigation team spent days analyzing the hidden database and the software modifications that had been made to the scanners. What they discovered was both technically impressive and deeply disturbing. The system had been designed to identify stress patterns, deception indicators, and even subtle signs of potential security risks or personal vulnerabilities. Agent Martinez shared some of the findings with Marcus during one of their regular interviews. The system was sophisticated enough to detect when someone was lying during the voice authentication process, when they were under unusual stress, or when their normal behavioral patterns had changed in ways that might indicate security concerns. Marcus was fascinated by the technical capabilities, but he was also horrified by the privacy implications. Who was accessing this data? What were they using it for? That was the key question that the investigation team was struggling to answer. The hidden system had been accessed regularly, but the access logs were encrypted and the database queries had been designed to avoid leaving obvious traces. It was clear that someone had been using the collected data for some purpose, but determining who and why was proving extremely challenging. As the investigation continued, Marcus found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His technical skills made him valuable to the investigators, who frequently asked for his insights about how the system worked and how it might have been modified. But he was also still considered a potential suspect, since his quick identification of the problem could theoretically indicate prior knowledge of the system. Tom Reeves was experiencing similar scrutiny. As the senior hardware technician, he had the access and expertise that would have been necessary to modify the scanners. The investigators were particularly interested in his work schedule and his interactions with the equipment over the past year. They're looking at everyone who had the technical capability and security access to make these modifications, Tom explained to Marcus during one of their supervised conversations. The problem is that describes most of the senior technical staff in the building. Janet Morrison was also under investigation, though her administrative role made her a less likely suspect for the actual technical modifications. However, her position would have given her the authority to approve or cover up unauthorized changes to the security systems. The stress of being under suspicion was taking a toll on everyone involved. Marcus found himself constantly second-guessing his interactions with colleagues, wondering if casual conversations were being interpreted as evidence of conspiracy or misconduct. The collaborative, friendly atmosphere that had initially attracted him to the job was replaced by suspicion and paranoia. 3 weeks into the investigation, Dr. Kane made a breakthrough that changed the entire direction of the case. While analyzing the hidden software, she discovered that the unauthorized modifications contained code signatures and programming techniques that matched known patterns from foreign intelligence operations. This wasn't an inside job, she explained to Marcus during an emergency briefing. At least not entirely. The modifications show clear evidence of techniques and methodologies that are associated with advanced persistent threat operations conducted by foreign intelligence services. The revelation that the facility might have been compromised by foreign intelligence operatives sent shockwaves through the investigation team. If hostile actors had gained access to the building's security systems, they could potentially have been monitoring and analyzing the behavior of everyone who worked there, including people with access to highly classified information. Agent Martinez briefed Marcus on the new direction of the investigation. We now believe that someone inside the facility was working with foreign operatives to install and maintain the unauthorized surveillance system. This makes everyone who had access to the technical systems a potential suspect, but it also means that there may be additional security breaches we haven't discovered yet. The investigators began conducting more intensive background checks on all technical personnel, looking for any connections to foreign nationals, unexplained financial activities, or other indicators that someone might have been compromised. They also started analyzing the behavioral data that had been collected to see if it revealed patterns that could help identify the insider threat. Marcus was both relieved and terrified by these developments. He was relieved because the foreign connection made it less likely that he would be considered a primary suspect, given his recent hiring and limited access to sensitive systems. But he was terrified by the implications of what had been happening right under everyone's noses. The idea that foreign intelligence operatives had been analyzing his behavior, stress levels, and psychological patterns was deeply unsettling. Even worse was the realization that the same analysis had been conducted on everyone in the facility, including people who worked with information that could affect national security if it was compromised. Dr. Kane showed Marcus some of the behavioral analysis reports that had been generated by the hidden system. The level of detail was extraordinary and invasive. The system had identified his sense of humor as a potential security risk factor, noting that people who made jokes in inappropriate situations might be more likely to engage in other forms of inappropriate behavior. The psychological profiling capabilities are actually quite sophisticated, Dr. Kane explained. The system was analyzing speech patterns, stress indicators, behavioral changes, and even social interaction patterns to build comprehensive psychological profiles of facility personnel. The reports included assessments of each person's potential vulnerabilities, including financial stress, relationship problems, ideological concerns, and personality traits that might make them susceptible to recruitment by hostile intelligence services. Marcus's profile noted his relative inexperience, his student loan debt, and his tendency toward irreverent humor as factors that might make him a recruitment target. The really concerning thing, Dr. Kane continued, is that this kind of behavioral analysis could be used not just to identify potential threats, but to actively recruit and manipulate people. If foreign operatives had access to these psychological profiles, they would know exactly how to approach each person to maximize their chances of success. The investigation team was now working under the assumption that the unauthorized surveillance system was part of a larger intelligence operation designed to identify and recruit assets within the facility. The behavioral data would have provided foreign operatives with unprecedented insights into the personal and professional vulnerabilities of everyone who worked there. As the investigation entered its fourth week, Marcus began to realize that his casual observation about clicking sounds had uncovered something far more significant than a simple privacy violation. He had accidentally discovered evidence of what appeared to be a sophisticated foreign intelligence operation that had been targeting the facility and its personnel for months. The weight of this realization was overwhelming. Marcus had gone from being an excited new employee to being a key witness in a counterintelligence investigation that could have national security implications. He was also beginning to understand that his career in cybersecurity would be forever shaped by his role in uncovering this security breach. But even as the investigation continued to reveal new and disturbing details about the scope of the unauthorized surveillance, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there were still important questions that hadn't been answered. The technical sophistication of the system suggested resources and expertise that went beyond what even advanced foreign intelligence services typically possessed. Someone with extraordinary technical skills and unprecedented access to classified systems had been operating inside the facility for months without detection. And despite all the investigation and analysis, the identity of that person remained a mystery. The breakthrough that finally solved the case came from an unexpected source: Marcus himself. 5 weeks into the investigation, while reviewing technical documentation about the building's security systems, he made a connection that had eluded all the professional investigators. It started with what seemed like a casual observation during one of his regular interviews with Dr. Kane. They were discussing the technical complexity of the unauthorized modifications when Marcus mentioned something that had been bothering him since the beginning of the investigation. "The programming style and the hidden software looks familiar," he said, studying code samples that Dr. Kane had shown him. "Not familiar like I've seen it before, but familiar like I've studied similar techniques in academic settings." Dr. Kane looked up from her notes with sudden interest. "What do you mean by academic settings? Are you talking about university coursework?" Marcus nodded, but his expression was thoughtful rather than certain. "The algorithms used for behavioral analysis, the way the data structures are organized, even the variable naming conventions. They remind me of research papers I read during my graduate studies. Cutting-edge academic research into biometric security and behavioral analysis." This observation sent Dr. Kane scrambling to review the technical evidence from a completely different perspective. Instead of looking for signs of foreign intelligence operations, she began analyzing the code for connections to university research programs and academic publications. What she discovered was startling. The unauthorized system incorporated algorithms and techniques that had been published in academic papers over the past 3 years. Papers that represented some of the most advanced research in a biometric security and behavioral analysis. More importantly, all of the papers came from a single research program at a prestigious university, a program that was partially funded by government grants to develop next-generation security technologies. This wasn't a foreign intelligence operation, Dr. Kane explained to the assembled investigation team during an emergency briefing. This was an unauthorized field test of experimental security technology developed by Dr. Amanda Foster's research group at Stanford University. Dr. Foster was one of the leading experts in biometric security and behavioral analysis, and her research was frequently cited in academic and government publications. Her team had been developing advanced techniques for detecting deception, analyzing behavioral patterns, and identifying potential security threats through automated analysis of biometric data. Agent Martinez immediately contacted Dr. Foster's research program to inquire about any connections to Meridian Defense Solutions. What she discovered was that one of Dr. Foster's graduate students, David Park, had completed an internship at Meridian the previous summer. During his internship, he had worked on upgrading the building's biometric security systems. Park had access to all the technical systems, detailed knowledge of our security protocols, and the expertise needed to install experimental software without detection, Agent Martinez explained to Marcus during another interview. More importantly, he had academic motivations rather than financial or ideological ones. He was conducting unauthorized research using our facility as a real-world testing environment. The investigation team tracked down David Park at Stanford, where he was completing his doctoral dissertation on behavioral biometrics and security applications. When confronted with the evidence, he initially denied any wrongdoing, but eventually admitted to installing the experimental software during his summer internship. I was trying to test whether the algorithms we had developed in controlled laboratory settings would work in a real-world environment, Park explained during a recorded interview that Dr. Kane shared with Marcus. The biometric scanners at Meridian provided the perfect opportunity to collect data under realistic conditions with subjects who weren't aware they were being studied. Park claimed that he had intended to remove the experimental software before his internship ended, but had been unable to do so without risking detection. He had continued to monitor and maintain the system remotely, using backdoors he had installed in the network infrastructure. The data we collected was invaluable for my research, Park continued. We were able to validate our theoretical models and identify behavioral patterns that would have been impossible to detect in controlled laboratory studies. From a scientific perspective, it was an incredible success. Marcus was simultaneously impressed by the technical achievement and horrified by the ethical violations involved. Park had essentially conducted an unauthorized human subjects experiment on hundreds of federal employees and contractors, collecting intimate behavioral and psychological data without consent or approval from any institutional review board. Dr. Kane explained that Park's actions violated numerous federal laws, university policies, and ethical guidelines for human subjects research. Even though his motivations were academic rather than malicious, the unauthorized collection of biometric and behavioral data represented serious criminal activity. The behavioral profiles that were generated from this data could be used to manipulate or coerce the people who were studied, Dr. Kane explained. Even if Park didn't intend to use the information for harmful purposes, the mere existence of such detailed psychological profiles creates significant security risks. The investigation revealed that Park had been working under the general supervision of Dr. Amanda Foster, though she claimed to have no knowledge of the unauthorized field testing at Meridian. However, her research program had clearly benefited from the data that Park collected, and several academic papers have been published using insights derived from the unauthorized surveillance. This case represents a completely new type of insider threat. Agent Martinez explained to Marcus as the investigation began to wind down. Park wasn't motivated by money, ideology, or coercion. He was motivated by academic curiosity and the desire to advance his research. That makes him much harder to detect using traditional security screening methods. The implications of the case extended far beyond Meridian Defense Solutions. The investigation revealed that Park had also installed similar experimental software at 2 other government facilities where he had worked as an intern or contractor. The scope of the unauthorized data collection was much larger than anyone had initially realized. Federal prosecutors ultimately decided to pursue criminal charges against Park for unauthorized access to government computer systems, violation of privacy laws, and conducting unauthorized human subjects research. Dr. Foster's research program was suspended pending a thorough review of its data collection and research methods. For Marcus, the resolution of the case was both satisfying and unsettling. He was proud of his role in uncovering the security breach, but he was also sobered by the realization of how easily the facility's sophisticated security systems had been compromised by someone with legitimate access and advanced technical knowledge. The experience fundamentally changed his understanding of cybersecurity threats. Traditional approaches to security focused on protecting against external attackers and malicious insiders who were motivated by financial gain or ideological extremism. But Park represented a different category of threat, someone whose actions were technically criminal but personally motivated by legitimate professional interests. The real lesson from this case, Dr. Kane told Marcus during their final interview, is that security systems are only as strong as the people who design, install, and maintain them. No amount of technology can protect against insider threats if those insiders have legitimate access and sophisticated technical knowledge. The investigation also revealed significant weaknesses in the oversight and auditing systems that were supposed to detect unauthorized modifications to security infrastructure. Park had been able to install and maintain his experimental software for months without detection, despite the facility's supposedly rigorous security monitoring. As a result of the investigation, Meridian Defense Solutions implemented new policies requiring independent security reviews of all system modifications, enhanced monitoring of technical personnel with high-level access, and regular audits of all security system components to detect unauthorized changes. Marcus was commended for his role in uncovering the security breach and was offered a permanent position with the facility's security team. His attention to detail and analytical thinking had identified a problem that could have continued indefinitely if he hadn't noticed those clicking sounds from the biometric scanners. "You have a natural instinct for identifying anomalies," Agent Martinez told him. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need in cybersecurity professionals." Most people become so accustomed to how systems are supposed to work that they stop noticing when something is different. The case also had broader implications for the cybersecurity field. It highlighted the need for better oversight of research programs that had access to sensitive government systems, and it demonstrated the importance of considering academic and research-motivated insider threats as part of comprehensive security planning. Dr. Kane published a paper about the case that became influential in cybersecurity circles, though all identifying details about the facility and individuals involved were removed to protect privacy and security. The paper emphasized the need for security professionals to think creatively about potential threats and to pay attention to subtle indicators that might reveal unauthorized activities. Marcus's experience became a case study in how careful observation and systematic thinking could uncover sophisticated security breaches that eluded traditional detection methods. His willingness to investigate unusual sounds from electronic equipment had revealed a threat that could have continued for years if it had remained undetected. Looking back on the entire experience, Marcus realized that his tendency to make jokes in inappropriate situations had actually served him well in this case. His casual, observant approach to his new environment had allowed him to notice details that more experienced personnel had begun to take for granted. Sometimes the most dangerous security threats are the ones that look normal, Marcus reflected during a presentation about the case to new security personnel. If David Park had been trying to steal information or sabotage our systems, he probably would have been caught much sooner. But because he was conducting research that was technically sophisticated and academically legitimate, his activities blended in with normal maintenance and upgrade work. The case also taught Marcus important lessons about the complexity of insider threat detection. Park had passed all standard security screenings, had legitimate reasons for accessing the systems he modified, and had technical expertise that made his activities appear normal to casual observation. Detecting his unauthorized research required exactly the kind of careful attention to subtle anomalies that Marcus had demonstrated. As Marcus settled into his new role with the facility's security team, he continued to think about the broader implications of what had happened. The incident had revealed fundamental challenges in balancing security requirements with operational needs, protecting privacy while enabling legitimate research, and maintaining oversight of highly skilled technical personnel. But perhaps most importantly, the case had demonstrated that effective cybersecurity required more than just sophisticated technology and formal procedures. It required people who were willing to pay attention to details, ask questions about things that seemed unusual, and think critically about whether systems were operating as they were supposed to. Marcus's joke that had started it all, whispered to a biometric scanner during his first week on the job, had never actually triggered the discovery of the unauthorized surveillance system. That discovery had come from his careful observation of clicking sounds that didn't belong. But, in a way, his casual approach to the technology had been exactly what was needed to identify a sophisticated threat that had been hiding in plain sight. The clicking sounds that had caught his attention turned out to be caused by additional data processing that the scanners performed after completing normal authentication procedures. Those few seconds of extra activity represented the unauthorized collection and analysis of behavioral and biometric data that had been going on for months without anyone noticing. In the end, Marcus's story became a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries come from paying attention to small details that everyone else has learned to ignore. The sophisticated security systems that protected the facility had been compromised not through dramatic hacking techniques or elaborate espionage operations, but through the patient, methodical work of someone who understood the systems well enough to modify them without detection. The case file was eventually classified and stored in secure government archives, but the lessons learned from Marcus's discovery influenced cybersecurity policies and procedures throughout the federal government. His experience demonstrated that effective security required not just advanced technology and formal procedures, but also the kind of careful observation and critical thinking that could identify subtle indicators of unauthorized activities. As Marcus continued his career in cybersecurity, he never forgot the lesson that sometimes the most important threats are the ones that appear most legitimate. And he never stopped paying attention to the small sounds and subtle details that might indicate something wasn't quite right with the systems he was responsible for protecting.